Um, Hello, I think we are live. I can't even tell because I can't see anyone, but everyone's coming in. Yes, our attendees list is growing. We'll wait a few minutes, and just so everyone knows, we are recording. We'll just let the room fill up.
Serenade us.
Um, Yay. All right, we're just gonna wait one more minute. Everyone's coming in, and we'll get started very soon. All right, yeah, let's get started. Um, Hello, everyone. Wow, so I'm really excited. I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time this evening to join us tonight, to join Center for Native Futures and our very first event, both in person and online virtually. So thank you for being here. So I'm Deborah Yepo-Papan. I'm one of the co-founders of Center for Native Futures. I'm Jemez Pueblo and Korean. I'm also a mother and wife and daughter, and a visual artist. Um, I'm also a Chicagoan, and although I consider myself a Chicagoan and I'm going into my land acknowledgement here, as a Jemez Pueblo and Korean woman, I acknowledge that I am a guest on this land. This land was home to Potawatomi people who were forcibly removed from here. Ojibwe, Odawa, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Miamia, Meskwaki, and Peoria people also had relationships with this land and each other. My respects and gratitude go out to all the Native ancestors who once lived here, and also to my Native brothers and sisters who continue to live here. So I hope you take the time to also acknowledge and learn about where you're at and whose land you're on, and continue that work of educating yourself and those around you. So again, I'm really excited this is kind of our, this is also our public announcement to announce Center for Native Futures. We've been doing it softly here and there on social media, and through our own personal pages and by word of mouth. This is a very exciting venture that a small group or collective of Native artists based here in Chicago have been dreaming about and have come together to create. And what we envision for Center for Native Futures is that we become the epicenter of Native creativity here in Chicago. Our dream is to provide gallery space, studio, and residencies for Indigenous artists, so that we are in a place where we are within proximity of each other to create and to support each other. So we're still building our foundation, and we have a lot of work to do, but we're really excited to move forward and to be where we're at right now, and to be able to offer events like these to you. And so lastly, before I hand this over to my partner and our other co-founder and very good friend of mine, Monica, I also want to mention that this event this evening is presented as part of Art Design Chicago Now, an initiative funded by the Terra Foundation for American Art that amplifies the voices of Chicago's diverse creatives, past and present, and explores the essential role they play in shaping the now. So very big thank you to Terra Foundation and Art Design Chicago Now. So I'm going to, oh, and housekeeping. We have disabled the chat, so you will not be able to chat with the panelists or other attendees, but we will be able to chat with you. And so we'll be sharing links and other information with you throughout the program. However, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A down below and feel free to add any questions throughout. We'll have a Q&A portion toward the end of the program, so maybe the last 25 minutes will be dedicated to that. So enjoy the program, and I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Monica.
Thank you, Deborah. Ani, thank you so much for being here for our inaugural event. We're very excited to have all you folks come out to listen to this wonderful discussion. It's about Indigenous people often walk in landscapes filled with irony and violence. In a sweeping and long overdue conversation, artist Andrea Carlson and scholar Jenny Davis will discuss ideas and misconceptions about public art, the problems around settler monuments to themselves, the looted and destroyed effigy mounds of Zhegagoynak. I'm really bad. I'm still learning my own Anishinaabe language, so excuse me. And how institutions in land now known as Illinois Thwart Native American Graves Protection Act and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. I'd like to introduce you to my wonderful colleague and wonderful friend, Andrea Carlson. She is an Ojibwe visual artist currently living here in Chicago. Her paintings and drawings reference cultural narratives in resistance to institutional authority, specifically that of museums. Her work has been acquired by institutions such as the British Museum, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the National Gallery of Canada. Carlson was a 2008 McKnight Fellow and a 2017 Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters Fellow. And a lovely scholar, Jenny Davis, is a citizen of Chickasaw Nation and associate professor of anthropology and American studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she is the director of American Indian Studies program and the Chancellor's Fellow of Indigenous Research and Ethics. I have the great honor of introducing these two. Please welcome Andrea and Jenny.
Bonjour, Nindinaway Moganidak, Andrea Carlson, Indigenous Cause, Idash Kageasagek, an Indigenous Cause, Zhegagoynak, Nindunjaba, Idash Iche Onegama Ming, Aishkonagang, Mikanak Nindodem, Miigwech Bizadawik. My name is Andrea Carlson, and I'm Turtle Clan. I'm Ojibwe, and I live in Zhegagoynak, Chicago, on Potawatomi land. And thank you all for joining Jenny and I.
Micha Mishrislo, so Hosipo Ihoshilambash Lushpa, Micha Jenny Davis, Chickasaw, Micha Naholosaya, Oklahoma, Mintali. Thanks to the Antokmishki, to the Center for Native Futures for inviting me here today to have this conversation with Andrea and with you all. I'm honored to be here. In my introduction, my name is Jenny Davis. I am Chickasaw from Oklahoma, so I am a guest here in these lands and always honored to be in conversation with the folks for whom these are their homelands, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I've been wanting, it seems like we've been on a panel before, and I've been wanting to talk with you, Jenny, for a very long time. So you're indulging me with this conversation, and we've had various conversations about the topics that we're going to cover tonight, just over dinner and just meeting each other up in different places, by chance. So this is maybe a more formal way of just having a conversation about some of these things. But should we go right to slides then?
Yeah, we'll see if I can manage the tech here. All right, is that good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I can slide here.
I think this is so to start off, where I'm located in the Loop in Chicago is Potawatomi land. I love to start with John Lau's this quote out of Imprints. If you have not read Imprints and you live in Chicago, it is a terrific book. It goes along the history of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi in the city of Chicago. It's like the history of Potawatomi people in Chicago. This quote, the Potawatomi say, "We walk on the bones of our ancestors to solemnize our connections to the ones who came before us, as well as to demonstrate our intimate connection to the land." I think this quote is absolutely brilliant because we walk around Chicago every day, and I think it is important, when I wake up, when I put my feet on the ground, to remind myself every day that this is Potawatomi land, that the Potawatomi this is the bones of their ancestors. And I, even though I'm Anishinaabe and I'm Ojibwe, and part of the Three Fires, which is the Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe people, those connections between our nations were built over years and years and years of meeting together, out of lighting a council fire, and about constantly checking in, constantly reaffirming our consent to live amongst each other.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can talk about and that will come up over and over again is the way that the topics that we're discussing are often framed as complicated and too complicated. And, when people have multiple and layered relationships to each other in the land, it's just a reason not to engage and not to be in conversation. And so I like the framing of Lo, and I think a lot of the ways of the things that we'll be talking about is kind of refusing that dismissal of the importance of these kinds of topics and of that approach to thinking about place and land.
And this slide on the lizard effigy mound in Chicago, you can find the information on the left. I think it's really interesting because there's a lot of people who feel or believe that that Native people had a false understanding of land ownership, or that there's a romantic view that Native people didn't understand land ownership, which may or may not be true, but Native people have definitely understood trespassing when other nations have trespassed on land that we derive our livelihoods and our health and well-being off of. So since from time immemorial and time in perpetual, we've always understood trespassing. And so I think that land acknowledgements, when they come out of this place of acknowledging whose land you're on, that's a tradition that has been with us for a long time. And it is this constant check-in to make sure that you are aware of whose ancestors you are walking on. And it's interesting when you think of the permanence of these statues and these monuments around Chicago, that the land is rarely considered. The land as its own monument is rarely part of that conversation around monuments. Our earthworks were often destroyed in order to make buildings that had very little significant value in history back when they were being built. And now they're the very tools of our erasure are the things that are celebrated, are the histories that are celebrated.
Yeah, and I think if we have time to get into the conversations about NAGPRA and repatriation, I think the other, the things that this tie into are the connections between a place, a space, and its value by who doesn't have access to it and the protocols of access, as well as values for things that aren't broken into pieces and carried off, right? So not by how something could be removed or circulated or taken and individualized but by what it provided to in a communal way, but not in a kind of universal no rules kind of way, right? So the way that it's a different way of operating with space than people are often thinking.
Yeah, and when it comes to things like earthworks and effigy mounds, things that have always existed, I think there might be a misunderstanding in maybe non-native communities that we have continuity to these art forms, such as or the different ceremonial complexes and our various traditions that tie us. We didn't lose continuity. We have epistemological connections to our ancestors. And I'm not Chickasaw, but I know that Chickasaw Nation continues to build mounds and has maintained that continuity within the nation, which I think is really interesting. And here in Chicago, there seems to be that disconnect where a number of mounds have been flattened over or paved over, and now we have artists like Santiago X in the city making mounds, and so it seems like there's this big gap between mound making, and it's a good thing that he's taken it on. But I know that with your nation there isn't really a continuity gap, that it's kept going.
Yeah, and I think some of that it depends too on the kind of maintenance of practices post removal, and so there's a way of understanding how do we keep these things going in a place like Oklahoma that is not the place where we've been doing them, but also there's a strong commitment to maintaining those spaces in homelands, and so thinking about how do you have responsibility to two places at once and practice those things and places where somebody else has moved in and you've moved into, been brought to, right, a new place. And so I think there's a lot of interesting conversations about how you do that. How do you maintain it, and what does it mean to bring it into a totally new, when you cross the Mississippi, you enter into an entirely new world there. So those are definitely conversations that connect to lots of practices, and of course thinking about the mound building, and also just behavior around mounds and passing on the caretaking is even, I would say, even within Oklahoma, there's an assumption that those traditions have not been there, or that the connection to those places doesn't exist because we're no longer in those spaces, or we don't have as easy access to them. And so when we think and talk about the homelands, people are often articulating that, that why would we go, and what would be the point, and are we even connected to those spaces anymore? And so it's thinking about connecting to the practices that we would use in those spaces, even if we're doing them in a totally different, thousands of miles away. Yeah.
So continuing on with just landscape, I think this is one of the, when it comes to monuments and how the earth, for me, I feel like the land is its own witness. The land has monumental capacities baked into it. So for those of you who don't know, in 1917, the Supreme Court ruled against the Kagan Band of Potawatomi in a case that's often referred to as the Sandbar case, or Williams versus the City of Chicago. What had happened was the Treaty of Chicago had been signed, the Potawatomi had been removed, and the Trail of Death, what is often referred to as the Trail of Death. And then the city went ahead and pushed bits from the fire of 1871 and other debris into the lake in order to create, quote unquote, new land. And the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi said you can't do that. That you can't make new land. This land that you've created was never ceded by us. It's not mentioned in any of these treaties, so it is not yours. And it, like a lot of our cases, went up to the Supreme Court. In 1917, the Supreme Court clearly ruled against the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, because at that time it was really hard for Native land claims to get sanctioned by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was clearly working on the side of the colonists, and it's their legal system. So even though that's true, the land is still not ceded. It was never relinquished by the Potawatomi people. And I've brought up this story in the past, and people were like, well, it wasn't, the Supreme Court ruled that it was abandoned. It didn't exist prior. But I'll hear people kind of trying to play devil's advocate with me and say, well, it wasn't really Potawatomi land because it wasn't really land at the time that the Potawatomi flourished in Chicago. And to that I say, what if I was to get a bunch of debris and to put it out in Lake Michigan and build my own Andrea Carlson Island? And I was to live on it, and I was to build, a hotel on it, or multiple hotels on it, or maybe even a cultural center and museum. I have a feeling that the city and the state and the federal government would come down on me pretty hard. And they would be demanding taxes. They wouldn't let me stay. I would be evicted quickly, and I would be foot the bill for removing that landfill. I would face all the apparatus of the United States government would come down pretty hard on me. So when Indigenous people have said, no, you can't do this, this wasn't part of our agreement, and then people are like, oh, well, they're trying to find a way of making space for the settler narrative to work its way into that argument. It's like, no, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi are a sovereign nation, and this was a trespass into waters that did not belong to the city of Chicago. They lost the case and haven't really pressed it since then. But it's really important to understand that when you walk along the magnificent mile that used to be the shoreline, that when you look at that strip of land, that's all landfill, it's where the settler Chicago tells its stories. It's where WBEZ is. It's where the Field Museum is. It's where the Art Institute is. It's where all of these cultural institutions are. It's where MCA is. It's where the Arts Club of Chicago is. It's where all of these museums plant themselves, is on this strip of unceded land. So now a lot of these organizations are writing land acknowledgements, and in their land acknowledgements, every one of them should say that that are on that land, that they're on unceded land. It was never relinquished. And I think it's a really important narrative to remember. And it's also where Grant Park is. It's where the Columbus statue was. And we need to consider that the land that these monuments and these institutions that tell the story of settlers or prioritize the stories of settlers, that they are telling it from the positionality of a monument, of a violation of the Potawatomi people. That's my rant.
I mean, absolutely. And I think that, this is also such a great indication of where colonial legal systems never hold themselves accountable to their own laws. And so, openly flowing water has its and functions under an entirely separate legal system. And the assumption that, even legal, through treaty or otherwise right to land, the assumption that equals right to water is definitely not something that's held up in any other context. And so, there are multiple angles through which the Pokagon have responsibility rights, right? And through that, in a Western context, legal rights to that space and anything that emerges from it or anything that's brought to it, but definitely not something that's going to be held up within a system that wasn't meant to hold up that from the first place.
Yeah, it wasn't made by them, and it was definitely not made to serve them, the legal apparatus of the United States. but I could go on, and I will not.
Love to do a walking tour of the sandbar there. Oh, I think, okay.
So we're just going to go straight to firsting and lasting in Chicago. This, if you read this plaque, the Kinsey Mansion, you see this a lot in various plaques and monuments around the city. You see firsts, the city's first white child, Ellen Marion Kinsey. Chicago loves firsts. We can go on to the next slide, but there's clearly white supremacy built into that text. So the historian Jeannie O'Brien, I call her Jeannie O'Brien, everyone calls her Jeannie, but if you know her, but Jean M. O'Brien, white Earth Ojibwe, coined the term firsting and lasting, and her research primarily deals with like what is referred to as like New England, Boston, and Massachusetts area. She coined the term, and it means that all of the firsts in this kind of settler constructs and mentality belong to the settlers. It's the first baby born in such and such an area. It's the first this, the first that, all belongs to settlers. It's all like, because they're creating their initial histories. And then lasts are all given to natives. Last of the Mohicans, the last wigwam in this place, the last native nation to leave any given city, the first cemetery. And I have a kind of a funny story. The author Leanne Howe and Susan Power and I were in Salem, Massachusetts, and we were just kind of touring around the city, and we asked the concierge at our hotel what we should be doing in Salem. And he had some suggestions, but he said, you really need to check out the second cemetery in the United States. It's located down the block, and you really need to go check it out. And I don't think he realized he was talking to Native women. And I was looking at them like, are you going to get this? Or what are you, which one of us are going to tell them that it cannot possibly be the second cemetery in in North America? And so we didn't. We left with smirks on our faces. And I was, kind of razzed Leanne a little, like, why didn't you tell them that there's just no possible way that that's the second cemetery in North America? And she laughed and she said, oh, Andrea, I can't do a Southern accent, I won't even try, but she said, Andrea, they don't call our graves, they call our graves archaeological sites. And I thought that was just, her, just kind of the wisdom of Leanne is just so just kind of spot on. Mm-hmm. That they don't consider our graves. They don't consider our places. They don't consider that. They don't, since the humanity has been stripped from our sacred places, from our from places where we mourn and from our memory work and places where we do that. Since that's taken away, we become subjects for archaeologists. So I think that was, for me, that's was a big moment for my understanding. But if you need a word for it, it's firsting and lasting, and Jeannie O'Brien's our person.
Yeah, behind that. One of my favorite accounts that she narrates in the book is, I think it's like the first bath that's taken in New England by the Puritans, which it just I think it was Puritan, so deeply funny, right, in the sense that these are folks who didn't have a great appreciation for bathing, and definitely didn't have an appreciation for the methods of regular bathing. And so just the kind of account of what would count and then what gets memorialized in ways that, you think, okay, maybe it's the first church or maybe it's the first building, but actually every tiny thing that anyone did got some kind of plaque or some kind of story that's being told. And bathing was so exceptional among them at the time that the first time it happened when they reached land, it got to be, memorialized within a text. And so, the levels of firsting and lasting are really extensive. And I think she does a nice job too of showing that it starts in New England, it starts in those moments, but then it spreads throughout the entire country and far beyond it. So we do see it in Chicago. We see it in, I often have my students do an exercise where they go to the, if their hometown has a web page and look at how it's narrativized, right? And look at what it accounts for its first, or and it shows up at everything from the smallest small town narrative and all the way up to kind of the large cities, and really allow for a framing that has major impacts, right? Including who gets to be the focus of memorials. And right, so
yeah.
Columbusing and firsting and
Columbusing and firsting, it's the same. There's some more on a website was started called A People's Guide to Firsting and Lasting in Boston, and this ended up being a project where there would be a number of events where Native people could talk about the erasure and meet at various monuments to complicate, not even just complicate the narratives, but to tell the truth, these histories and how they're conveyed, the romanticness, the romance behind some of how our stories are portrayed publicly and in public spaces are so very harmful. So this project gave space back to Indigenous people to talk about the master narrative of Indian extraction. So.
And I think that, the lasting is equally as powerful in the framing in terms of saying last, last real Indian, last full blood, last of this group, last of that. And that is extremely pervasive. It continues to this day. And it's part of why, people are surprised to meet a living Native person, or they're surprised to find out, for example, that people are maintaining connections to those places because they were told that the last of that group, or, even the last of those practices ended 50, 100, 200 years ago, or 500 years ago. And so it really creates this stopping point where there's no expectation that we would ever be found past that point. And that, it's true for, again, cultural practices and just living people and the spaces, and it gives people free range to kind of do whatever they want and to reshape those spaces in their own name, right? And to be the first of something, whatever it is in that place.
And it is pervasive. It is everywhere. We see it everywhere, and Native people will buy into it too. It is a really strong narrative. And we're told, how marketing campaigns work. It's like, you have to be the only, you have to be the first. Your narrative has to show just how incredibly essential you are. And firsts are so incredibly important. And unfortunately, for a lot of Natives who have been denied access to certain things, we end up being the first Native to do a thing, whatever that might be, the first Native to serve in Congress, this first Native to, do anything. It seems like our firsts now, again, for a second time, or third or fourth time, will be they're being recognized in contemporary ways through firsting and lasting, and they're very strong narratives. But we need to kind of be aware of where this comes from and how it has a long history on this continent.
Yeah, and I think the way it kind of forecloses things, so it has to, I've thought about it a lot, and how the narrative about last speakers gets framed, and does that close the door on the communities who have been able to reawaken their languages, right? Or new speakers that come out. I think even at like personal levels where, yeah, you're the first Native person in the department, or more recently, you're the last remaining Native on campus or something, right? And so the ways those get framed and the way that they're so pervasive, not in a way that I think makes the intervention we're hoping for, but in fact just puts it into a slot that in fact says, these are the only notable moments. And so we've had one, who needs any more? Or we're down to the last, so it's done, right? Why would we do something to change that narrative? So I think they're very, very powerful. You want to
move to the next?
use it? Yeah.
So here is a first. Jean-Baptiste Sawball. Is considered Chicago's founder, the first non-native permanent settler of Chicago. This is a point that I like to bring up when talking about DuSable, is that he was Potawatomi kin. And if we remember again that Native nations operate more like sovereign nations, race and being racialized is something that comes later for our understanding of kinship. So DuSable married a Potawatomi woman named Kitahawa, and we often don't remember her name or don't recall it in the plaques and things around town. He would have, through that marriage, he would have had access to Potawatomi sovereignty, to the land. Without that relationship, it's very doubtful that he would have become a permanent settler of Chicago. But he's also a really important figure because he stayed with Kitahawa. He stayed with his family, and when she had been removed, he sold his land and left. Now, he still kind of operates in this position where he is Potawatomi kin, and he can operate under Potawatomi sovereignty, but he's treated by the United States as a settler. So he was allowed to sell his land when he left, whereas natives were forced to leave and they had to cede their land. And that the ability to sell or cede he was able to kind of operate in both capacities. And a lot of fur traders did that. They married Native women, had babies with them, were able to operate under Native protocols. And then as soon as they gained their wealth and their opportunity, then they often left their Native wives to return out east and marry white women. This is just a pattern that happens again and again and again. If you read up on nearly any of the fur traders that all these streets are named after throughout Chicago, you will find that they had taken, the fur trader men had taken Indigenous women in order to gain access to these really powerful trade networks. I think that that's really, this story is really important about DuSable, but I think that it's really important to not consider him in isolation from his family, and he had a Potawatomi family.
Yeah, and the stories, as you said, are so pervasive, and they're also speak to what happens when you have multiple layers and multiple sovereignties occurring within the same space or occurring in conflict. So in the Southeast, there are lots of stories where matriarchal and matrilocal. The clan and property went to women, and so there were a number of individuals, quite a lot actually. The most successful were often the white men, settler men, who would marry Southeastern Chickasaw, Cherokee, Choctaw Creek women, and so they would be, have enfranchisement and access to those women's land, right, to the political structure that they would marry into. So they were able to marry into that entire system and yet also have access to the entire settler society because it was patriarchal. And so you have individuals who emerge as the long-standing acquisition of power or wealth, or who end up being major players in things like removal and the Dawes rolls and those kinds of things because of those kinship relations. And yet when the narratives are told, all of those kinship ties just kind of disappear. And so it seems as though they walked out into the untamed wilderness and came back with riches and power and everything, not only completely on their own, but completely outside of those kind of government and kin structures that completely enabled what they were able to do.
We can go to the next. So here's what brings us here today. Clearly the title of this conversation with that image of a dead man on DuSable Bridge is the second slide here. The second image in this group has I was very surprised after moving to Chicago there that every time I crossed the DuSable Bridge, I saw him. And I'm not sure if he's dead, but his hand on his tomahawk looks like it's resting very loosely, like he is not, like he is perhaps dead. One thing to quickly mention about these monuments is that the natives are wearing plains wear. Anishinaabe people, Algonquin people, Woodlands people tend to dress differently. We don't have the same headdresses or styles of the things that we wear. When these reliefs were being made, you have to imagine the Buffalo Bill Wild West show and like this kind of all of our variety within our nations was being homogenized into a singular looking look or aesthetic to Native people. And this was also coming out of Western novels at that time. And we were losing all of our nuance when it came to settler perceptions of us. All of these bridge tender houses on DuSable Bridge, they each have in common this angel kind of floating up ahead. Like every one of these, the discoverers, the defense, the pioneers, and regeneration, like every single one of them was a mandate or dictate of heaven. Everything is justified under these columns. On the first column, the discoverers, the first relief, you can kind of see these allegories in these images where Native people are bent down, animal-like, on all fours. Their heads are not above the heads of the white discoverers, the settlers. You'll find that again and again in depictions of Native people where we're seen as bent or crouched and lowered. On the defense relief, you don't have that lowering, you have this kind of equal footing. But you also have an image of a dead man. There is a settler woman clinging to a child. That typically in these allegories, children, women clutching children, represents survival. That's the future. The child represents the future. So the inverse of that is often Native women in Western films and art, our deaths are portrayed as tragic but necessary, tragic but beautiful. So if you look at films, just, kind of like Legends of the Fall, the Native woman gets killed because she represents the ongoing of Native, like she's young, reproductive age. So by her death, it kind of signifies in an allegorical type way or symbolizes the people carrying on from generation to generation. So if she's killed, it's tragic, but it's beautiful, it's necessary. The Revenant, that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, his Native wife in that film dies tragically and birds come out of her mouth. It's beautiful, it's seen as aesthetically pleasing, but she also represents a continuation. So we often have the inverse when it's Native women, young Native women in these allegories. That's all I'll say about these.
Yeah, I think because we'll talk more about this in a second, but the blending together or the iconization of natives as a particular kind of native or as some kind of hodgepodge, right? We can recognize a lot of the themes in these images could be coming straight off of a sports jersey, right? So the replication of the double braids or the headdress or a lot of other things, right? That these are seen like First Thing and Last Thing, they are seen all the way across the US and this particular styling is pretty limited geographically, right? And so it's amazing how that gets picked up and taken. I mean, some of it both is portraying certain natives as the good ideal kind, and others as the kind that you would go to war with. Others are the kind of iconic recognizability. I remember the first time I saw this bridge, I mean, I'm always struck by the extent to which we're always so naked, and you know, just so you had time to put on a headdress, but not the rest of your outfit, and so which you usually put on last. So you know, it's always, there are a number of things going on, and so you know, I remember because when I was there, it was winter in Chicago, and I remember walking by thinking, like, these people had clothes, right? These people had outfits that they would have been wearing, and so it's not, you know, it's also the kind of stripped bareness and the primalness of what's being worn, even though it's very clear that there's extensive artistic abilities and practices, you know, even in just the creation of the headdresser and other things that we do see them wearing, even though it's very rare that we get to be wearing things.
I mean, it's so true. Like, there's desirability built into the bodies that we're looking at, but I think that we're definitely being portrayed as beautiful, noble savages. And it's such a tragedy that we have, that we are the quote unquote dying race, that this is how we were being, how we're being depicted as, like, it's so tragic that they have to die for our progress. And, right. You know,
tragic but inevitable, right? It's a kind of, yeah, and I guess, yeah, the appealingness of it. I've never seen a monumented, a statue of an Indian that didn't have a six-pack, and so I think there's something about the particularity of presentation, right, that is tied to the way that they then get Native men, Native women then get carried into contemporary representations as well, right, and why people are calling on those images, the repetition of those images for particular things, like movies or sports or whatever.
So underneath the image of the dead man, there's defense, and we see things written on this, like the heroic defense of Fort Dearborn. You know, they will be the people who were killed in this massacre, you know, they were cherished as martyrs, you know, and it even says our early history. Well, that's not written for Jenny or myself. That this isn't, it's not, you know, our early history. It's not actually our history in our, like, we inclusive, including Indigenous people. So these kind of texts, these are all around us, and people take them for granted. There's a number of people who walk by that image of a dead man on DuSable Bridge, and they don't even see it. It's so ubiquitous. It's so baked into our built environments and in the stages that we find ourselves in. Right across from DuSable Bridge, kind of kitty corner on the corner, is the Blackhawks team store. If you don't know who Black Hawk was, he was a political prisoner. And I feel that wearing his severed head as a mascot on your person, it is contemporary, it is, you know, modern day trophy taking. It should not exist. It needs to stop. The Blackhawks team name is wrong and it needs to stop. But then to put their store at the former site of Fort Dearborn seems so incredibly antagonistic. It seems purposeful. That is also the site of the sandbar that the sandbar claim is named after, that the Pokagon band of Potawatomi had sued the city over. So that particular area of Chicago is filled with antagonistic things. So I think that we should also remember this bridge for that violence and for the continued perpetual violence that invites itself to that place, including the Blackhawks team.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think as we're thinking about monuments, which we might hopefully have get to, you know, like what are they speaking to and for, and what are people, what appeals to people in those kinds of, whether it's the t-shirt or the bridge, right, and those monuments, I think is an important piece of the conversation that often gets dropped out in favor of some other areas that are actually more about specificity, which is important, but also misses some of those connections, right? To look at the, again, to think about land, to stand there and turn around and think about all of the layers and complexities, and think about the ways that people are moving through those spaces and have moved through those spaces, and what they're encountering in a given moment, right? And the layers of it. So, you know, what does it mean that somebody might be looking at this bridge and this commemoration while wearing a jersey, right, while standing on the sandbar, I think is a particular, that viewing them all as separate components and separate acts is part of what allows for them to be dismissed as not a big deal, or things to which people are being overly sensitive, right? But when you start to add them all together, then you can see the kind of mathematical arithmetics that we have to do when we're in that place.
Absolutely. So it's again the idea of the vanishing colonized. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody could that's here with us today can correct me if I'm wrong. But this end of the trail sculpture by Fraser, if I am not mistaken, the artist that did the DuSable bridge bridge houses worked under Fraser for a while. But this is one of those allegorical type images. I don't think there's one of these sculptures at the Art Institute, but it's not on public display. But these are allegorical images. The vanishing colonized, the vanishing race, manifest destiny, the end of the trail allegory. Native people were supposed to be stoically accept our fate, and we were supposed to, you know, gracefully exit off the stage of the American dream. This was supposed to be something that we would be like our genocide was supposed to be commemorated as us accepting our fate for a greater purpose, which was white supremacy. And so these things are linked in American imagination and settler imagination to this day. This fantasy is heaped upon our artwork, on our narratives, on our mere existence. So I just wanted to make sure that this is not something that we're glossing over, that all of these monuments are intended to perpetually hurt us, to perpetuate harm against us.
Yeah, and one of the versions of this is in a museum in Tulsa that they regularly take school children to see, schools that have, you know, 30% or more Native students, right? It then becomes the art history that you have to learn, so that we learn the names of Remington and Fraser and the other folks that are sculpting these realities as a kind of, you know, third grade field trip for those conversations. So I think that the pervasiveness of it, and then the just kind of casual way in which they're threaded through the conversations that that we're expected to encounter and be able to recall and then produce as part of a, you know, American history or American civics or whatever it's called in third grade. But yeah, those pieces.
And this terrible piece, this is not on view. It was removed in 1997 because of protests. The Columbus statue that went down in Grant Park, you know, had been protested for a long time, and so had this piece that is no longer on view. But it depicts Margaret Helm, this white woman, kind of at the center, and you can see on the left side a Native man about to maybe whack her on the head, and then there's another Native man on the right side who has his hand up to stop the blow. And that the man that is preventing this woman from being harmed is said to be Black Partridge, who's a Potawatomi chief. And this was, you know, depicting Fort Dearborn. Margaret Home was the stepdaughter to John Kinsey, and she was the wife of I think the commander of Fort Dearborn at that time. And so it is said that her life was spared by Black Partridge. This is, one of those types of stories where, like again with Noble Savage, he's doing something Black Partridge in this narrative of saving the white woman. And white women narratives are really super important to white supremacy because, as I had mentioned, it's the inverse of how Native women are depicted as the continuation of the people. Well, white women are also depicted as the continuation, as a material possession, and so this is an image that is that kind of justifies whiteness in this area, or justifies settler settler presence in Chicago.
Yeah, and I think all of these monuments, they often, if there are natives present, then it's an act of violence as antagonizers or at their demise. But I have never seen a monument of someone who was weaving, or somebody who was farming, or I don't know, napping. That's a indigenous pastime from. So right, like when we think about what gets represented, and then how that plays into the imaginary of natives as violent or hostile, or right, whether it's in interactions in day-to-day life, whether it's in an encounter with the police, whether it's right, then this framing of natives as kind of always a moment from enacting violence or being the victims of it inherently, right? I think the two sides of that play out in statistics, and they play out in kind of day-to-day experiences in courtrooms and on the street and in lots of places that, again, are really naturalized through the kinds of things people walk by all the time.
Yeah, and this particular piece, the native models were prisoners of war at Fort Sheridan, and they had to model this. And it's also I think when you see monuments like this, and you see Native faces in these forums, sometimes you're actually looking at prisoners of war. Sometimes you're actually looking at people who are living in captivity. And I think that it's really important that truth also be told, that these aren't just innocuous, like just artwork. These are artwork perpetuated on violence and perpetuating violence. So I think that's important detail of this and other pieces around Chicago.
Yeah, I remember seeing an exhibit of some paintings of Native individuals, and I was walking through, and I remember several of the portraits said that they were painted at Fort Sill, and that's in Oklahoma. I'm familiar with it, right, in its history with Native peoples, and I kind of looked at it and thought, at that time, these Native people, they would be prisoners of war. And it turns out that indeed these paintings that are kind of held up to be beautiful paintings of natives, and that have an entire circulation outside of the context of that these are captivity paintings. These are portraits that people did not willingly sit for, and that the painters would not have had, our sculptors would not have had access to, were they not being held. And they're women and elders and natives of all ages being held as prisoners of war. And so I think the ubiquity of access and the right to access, and not having a conversation about how and why would someone have had access to someone posing for these things, right? And that has to do with monuments that are coming out of the Columbia exhibition, where people were doing all sorts of measuring and studying and photographs, right? Lots of sketches, and that the question of how people had access to it, and whether or not the people that are being represented consented, is a deep-seated connection to the ways that there's already an assumption that access to us for art or research should be inherent, and that you have to kind of fight to be able to have a say and to have the rights of a participant and to participate willingly, right? Though that is perpetuated all the way through today, when the assumption is you don't have to ask still if it's a Native person, whether it's an archaeological site or a contemporary research study, right? That's
yeah. We have about 10 minutes left, so we can, or 5 minutes left, so we can go through the next few slides pretty quick, but we might go over time a little bit. So of course, this is the Grant Park Columbus statue. I mean, we don't have to unpack this. He never set foot on North America. He committed genocide. There's in the base of this piece is a portrait of Mussolini, the term power. Ironically enough, not the sculpture of the Columbus himself, but this base, the pedestal that remained. The architect that designed this space also designed much of the architecture in Minneapolis. I used to live in Minneapolis, and on the University of Minnesota's campus. And I'm going to do a first thing, but one of the first Native American or American Indian Studies programs at the University of Minnesota is in Scott Hall. Scott Hall used to be an opera house, and the architect who built it was the same architect that built the base that Columbus used to stand on in Chicago. So I learned Ojibwe language in a building that was built by that architect. Anyway. Ironic landscapes that we all occupy, but this is the work of Chi Nations and Black Lives Matter Chicago and a number of other Native groups came together last summer and protested this and Lightfoot ordered that it be removed. And the next slide, let's see. When it was removed in the middle of the night, Ted Sitting Crow Gardner was one of the people who works for the city, and he's Standing Rock. And after it was removed, he wrote on the tape that was around that base, removed by a member of Standing Rock Sioux tribe, Mitakuyasin, which is Lakota for all my relations. So I think that's one of these kind of interesting, again, Natives live in an ironic landscape that the very city worker that was assigned with removing the Columbus statue was Native as well.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think also, in terms of doing good and contributing to community in Chicago, as somebody who is Standing Rock and the connections there between, what to be in this space and to enact that, while also being connected to all of the work that's happening back among Standing Rock in North Dakota.
So I wanted to put in this slide of how memorials don't have to, and monuments, in stone, like they cannot be moved, but a lot of memory work of Indigenous people in our memorials sometimes look like actions. The above slide is from the memorial ride that the Dakota people in Minnesota put on every year. The day after Christmas, the Dakota 38 +2 memorial rides. And this is to remember the lives lost after the Dakota War of 1862 and the violence that was enacted on Dakota men after that war. So if you don't know the story, there's a amazing poem by Bailey Long Soldier called 38, and she outlines it better than I ever could. But Abraham Lincoln signed the death decree for 38 Dakota men who there was a platform built, and they were hung simultaneously while holding hands and singing. And if you want to talk about this.
Just thinking about the ways that things get memorialized and continued in conversation and brought together, actually making connections while we're talking about this context, right? Leanne Howe's Savage Conversation is a great example of also thinking about these stories and how to tell them, how who the players are, right, in ways that actually incorporate a much more expansive and creative way, as only Leanne can, way of telling the story and making it a story with humanity, actually, even with anthropomorphic objects in there, but that it is, lots of ways of thinking about moments and how to memorialize them, or how to keep them something that we are being mindful of and remembering, not just, and in fact, in more robust and more careful ways and caring ways than something like a physical monument might do.
Of course, the image below the memorial ride is repatriation. So a number of museums across the United States have our ancestors in their collections stored in boxes. This is what repatriation looks like. This is bodies, bones, our ancestors in boxes that are being returned to the earth. And there's a Anishinaabe poet named Margaret Newton, who is a wonderful language speaker, and she composed songs because we have ceremonies for funerals, and we have ceremonies for everything, for weddings and for funerals and for coming of age, and we have ceremonies galore. But until colonization and only after colonization, and really 1990 with the passage of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, we have new ceremonies. And that one of these ceremonies is repatriation and returning the bodies to the earth. So she composed a number of songs that would be sung to the mounds while bodies were being returned to the earth. And that's, the harm of museums, one of the many harms of museums towards Indigenous people, and the rights to collect our bodies as though they're objects.
Yeah, and destroy the sites and contexts, to separate out families and individuals and the things that things and beings that we're buried with. So to the right to destruction and dismantlement and possession, I think, go hand in hand, right? So the right to possess land and the right to possess bodies as one and absolutely one is part of the other. And so when there's a resistance or a refusal for repatriation, that is also part of the conversation, that people are refusing to acknowledge the connection to land and the rights to land that people may have, and also the right to our own selves. So yeah, I think we have a couple more minutes, and we're almost done with the slides. So one of the things that I think was really interesting is just thinking about what monuments do, why do they exist, what's the point of them? And I was struck by the last piece of the, a general definition of monuments, where they represent outstanding, enduring, and memorable examples of something. And what strikes me is, and I mentioned earlier, a lot of the times the conversation or intervention around monuments or specific people is, let's correct this one historically inaccurate fact. And if we present, this new fact, then that will undo, right? Then people will understand, and people will abandon the idea of the statue. So you can say that Columbus never set foot in the US, and yet that doesn't have the impact that you might hope. You can say that DeSoto never made it to what's now Illinois, but there's a town named after him here. So, and why is it that those kinds of interventions don't work? And I think that it's, what the monuments are examples of, right? What are they examples of? They're not examples of the historical specificity. They are And I don't actually think they're being celebrated because of an absence of knowledge of their violence or despite it. I think they're celebrated because of it. That's part of the story, right? And so they are concrete, literal, right? Monuments to the inaction of violence. I think they're always operate as a promise of future potential violence, of what people are willing to do. So Columbus isn't memorable because he stepped foot in the US. He's memorable because he was willing to sail across the world to enact the things that he did, right? And I think even the monuments to the Confederacy, it's not important that to some folks that the Confederacy didn't win. What's memorable is that people were willing to go to war to preserve white supremacy. And so I think it's the promise of violence, and I think it's the an homage to the kind of work they did specifically is why people are being like those statues and like what they represent, in the same way that you can say this is not an accurate representation of what these people would have worn. This is not an accurate representation of how this event went down. It's not actually important whether it's historically accurate. What's important is that this tells a story people want to hear or that they like to see, even if they don't like to see it, that supports where they're at in the world. And so that, you know, undoing that requires undoing other things. So yeah, I mean, I see, yeah. So I guess part of it is that the conversation for me is often not framed around what monuments are actually doing, and it is often trying to make interventions at the pieces that I'm not sure people actually care about, which is the, you know, historical accuracy or those things. I mean, we care about them because they're our stories, right? But you know, the people who built those monuments were not concerned with those kinds of facts.
And it also reminds me of like you know, Truck and Yang, like how this is also tied into settler futurity. I was posting about Indigenous Peoples Day on Twitter, and then I got the, you know, this to the victor goes the spoils, or the victors get to write the histories, or I got this kind of a reaction, and it's like, well, there's still winning yet to be had. You know, just give us some time, we're coming for you. So, but that settler, they win once, and then they get all of our futures, and it's like, no, we're here for that.
Absolutely. And I know Chris is here for the Q&A, but I'm gonna go to one last slide, and that was the connection of monuments to linguistic monuments of things, and what it means to take Indigenous place and rename it after yourself as much as you put up a statue to yourself. And so you have and also the kind of etymological bleaching or whitewashing, where people don't even remember or know that the names they are still using come from Indigenous languages. And so it's the erasure of that connection to nativeness, and that kind of settler linguistic monuments are always very specific, but we are, again, generic. And so we get to be the Indian trails and the Indian boundary, whereas you get to, you know, Columbus and Lincoln and Marquette and DeSoto and all the others get to be, have their specific name circulating and naming everything from parks to universities to, you know, entire regions. All right, Chris, don't shut us down here.
I'll try not to. Well, thank you guys so much for that wonderful conversation. It's just been a privilege to listen in and be a part of it. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insight into these important issues of affecting us as Indigenous people, but also, you know, it affects everyone, because, you know, then, you know, if, you know, people don't realize how these things affect us, then they become complicit in that, and then, you know, and then it's, you know, and then it just creates more problems. So you know, that's, the knowledge is power, and the knowledge is healing. So thank you for that. We have a few questions, and one of them is kind of going back earlier in the presentation, talking about reparations, and this person wants to know what kind of reparations are appropriate.
So one of the things, I don't know if this is a reparation, but I think that One of the things that's happening right now, a conversation that's happening, is #landback. In Illinois, there are no reservations. Those are really cool access points of power, of negotiation with governors and with the federal government. They're, having seen sovereignty work out, and in my home state of Minnesota, moving to Illinois where there isn't reservations, where there isn't that access point, where there isn't that is really upsetting. But that's not our future. Apparently, Ho-Chunk Nation has purchased land around Starved Rock, and it is in tribal trust. And so we might start seeing reservations or tribal trust lands come back into Illinois in our future. And I think that will be, it'll have different diplomacy related to it, hopefully. So if you are listening to this conversation and you want to be an ally to Indigenous people, and say you have money and you own some land, farmland, let's say, figure out who to give that back to. Give it back. It can be put in a tribal trust, and hopefully in the future we can change that. It's a lot of work, but I think Illinois really needs that. I'm not sure if that would fall under if that's repatriation, or it would be more like repatriation than it would be reparations. But I don't know, Jenny, do you have any ideas of what reparations would be appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, I do. One of my, I guess, thinking about the NAGPRA and other things, repatriation is often what comes to mind, because I think one of the most helpful pieces of that framework is that repatriation, we think of it as usually the physical handover of ancestors or of objects, but legally it's actually the return of control. And so I think as a framework, that is a really key piece for me. It's the part that people are often the most resistant to. It's that the decision making happens by the people who are the descendants and of those ancestors, or are the have treaty rights to those places or the ancestral homelands. And so I think that framework is actually potentially a way to add to our conversations of reparations, because reparations in some ways tends to be a kind of one object oriented and kind of one off potentially, right? So people think I can do this one thing and be done. Whereas a shift of control, like land back, is thinking about how do we operate under a totally different structure. But within the conversation of reparation, I have seen some models that I think are promising. One of the things we've been talking about is, setting up systems where, and this happens actually across the US in different ways, where like students, for example, can go to university for free in their homelands, right? So you should not have to pay to go to school in your own homelands, especially if you've been removed from that context. And so I think thinking about access to spaces that do have actual monetary requirements and considerations, that's a place where the framework of reparation can be helpful. The conversations about how land grant institutions were created through the theft and then sale of native lands, I think, again, those have monetary values to them that do have potential for being connected to a reparation type conversation. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think they need to be one or the other. And so I think some things fit within a model of thinking individually. One of the issues that comes to play in this is thinking about tribal governments rather than individuals, right? So this would not be the kind of thing where you would get the list of all the individuals, but rather you would be working with specific tribal governments. And I think that again has a slightly different framework that repatriation might be helpful to see kind of what works and what doesn't. Sorry about my cat.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's really good. I'm taking notes. I'm stealing this, Jenny.
Yeah, thank you guys. I'm going to try to kind of combine two questions here. So one person had asked if you think that monuments should be completely removed, or should they be contextualized so that people can learn think about it more deeply. And this interesting comment, which I feel kind of relates to this, is that this person is worried that murders of Indigenous peoples will be forgotten if these monuments are removed. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I don't think it should be like, I feel like that's if you set it up as should they be removed or should they be contextualized, you're given two options. But like, say for example, where the Columbus statue was in Grant Park, remove it, return it. I think that Grant Park should be given to the Pokagon Band of, like, returned land back to the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. Then people in Chicago can figure out how to say the name Potawatomi correctly. Whenever they go there, you know, Potawatomi people can decide the agency belongs to them, who they want to memorialize in that space that was stolen. So I always kind of try to bring it back to the earth itself and to agency, and who has agency, who has power, who has control over these spaces where monuments are erected. So I don't see it as a contextualize or move. I see it as what if we claw it all back and go back to the very basics of that this is trespassed land anyway. This is unceded land to begin with. But maybe that's too radical for many of the leaders in Chicago today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, in terms of the framing of the question and the problem and therefore the solution, I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that the way that monuments function in society is that the majority of people who go through Chicago don't notice the Indians on that bridge. They don't think about it. They don't blink. They are perhaps being guided by their phone if they're me. But you know, they are walking past these things without actually considering them. And so you could have a plaque on every corner and it wouldn't be the case that people would get that. You know, in terms of contextualizing, what would it take to put so many signs up to give the richness of that history, right? That people whose point is to get to some deep dish pizza, like, are they going to get that, right? Like, what's the focus? What are they going to see? And I think, you know, when I think about what the point of these memorials are, if the point is the kind of memorializing violence and kind of always having that be a lurking and potential threat, then the people who notice it are the people who are threatened by it, right? So the people who notice DuSable Bridge and these and Columbus statues are those of us for whom that is we are impacted both by the histories of violence and the potential future, always ongoing violence. And so we don't need contextualization for those monuments. I mean, a little bit of history in terms of which misrepresented tribe is here or who created it. But I think in general, I'm not sure what it would take to have them be contextualized, although maybe a museum of misguided monuments could be an interesting exhibit, or could be an interesting element. And I think, you know, one of the big pieces that, you know, would we forget about violence to Native people? Not if we remember that Native people are still alive. And in fact, you can, you know, there are plenty of narratives available and there are lots of there are people you can talk to, courses you can take, books you can read. And so, you know, that's where the lasting comes in. There are still plenty of people who are around to tell those stories extremely accurately. There are accounts available from all sorts of Indigenous peoples. And so if those are the stories that are being circulated, then we won't forget, right? But those are the things we want to be in place of those kinds of narratives.
I think that it's cool, like a museum of misguided monuments. It's also that's an interesting point, because there's a big difference between things that are put within an institution's walls that you don't see that when you're walking on the street corner. Like, this is public places. They're antagonistic to us as we go about the city. And we're probably the only ones that actually pay attention and are seeing them as Indigenous people, or people who care about Indigenous people. And Jenny and I were talking earlier about, you know, all the conferences that are hosted in Chicago, and, you know, we're chased down by our Native colleagues and academics and scholars that are like, I just walked by the weirdest sculpture. Can you explain it? You know, we both had this experience. Every Native scholar, artist, or academic that goes to a conference in Chicago has, you know, so I kind of, I had to start paying attention just so I'd have an answer, because, you know, for the longest I was just like, I don't know, it's just crazy white people stuff. But but I think that that it's definitely, there's a difference between things that are put on display in places where that's the context versus the context being outside and on your you know, way to work every day.
Sure. I wanted to read this last question kind of word for word, because I think it's important for people outside of Chicago to hear this person's experience, because I know who she is. She's part of our group, and she has a question. So she asks, the city and mayor put up a lot of resistance to taking down the Columbus statue. Now, a year later, what is the city doing about other settler monuments?
I have to find the question because you cut out in the middle of that.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's in our chat.
Okay. Look at it. So
I'll read it again too. So oh, go ahead.
The city and our mayor put up a lot of resistance to taking down the Columbus statue. Thousands of cops were sent to beat up and terrorize protesters. Now, a year later, what is the city doing about other settler monuments? So the violence around the Columbus statue and what ended up being the Columbus statue's temporary or questionable removal, like it could, you know, we might be walking downtown, it might just pop up again, who knows? It's just keeping us in that limbo, which is very disrespectful to the protesters, myself included. But I do think that I mean, I can't speak for what the city is doing about the other settler monuments. There is a monuments committee that has been formed, and they're studying it. I'm not part of the monuments committee, and neither is Jenny, but they are commissioning artwork, and you know, it is kind of maybe contextualizing, not fully removing everything. It sounds like it might be a case-by-case basis, but I can't speak for the monuments committee or the city or anything like that. But I will say that it's as an artist, I'm not an art historian, and I don't purport to be, and I don't speak for all natives, but as an artist, I do think that we are sometimes put out as the remedy. Like, nobody's going to attack an artist, put them out to shield these things, or we can, you know, misdirect through this artwork that's trying to educate people. But that's the same thing as, like, maybe an artist can give context for this very harmful image. And I think that that's a terrible position to put artists in. I don't think that is a remedy. I think that the city needs to grow up, and personally, I feel like these monuments need to be removed. You know, like how do you take the bridge houses off of DuSable Bridge? I don't know, but I think it could be done. So I think it should be done. But again, I'm just an artist with an opinion, and I cannot speak for the city and what the city should. I mean, I think they should remove it, but I have no authority over that.
I think so I don't have thoughts on Chicago itself, but I do know that one of the things that happens is through the monument reviews and the conversations, that this is sometimes the first, thinking about contextualizing things, this is sometimes the first time people have heard that, or either noticed something, but also heard that the individuals who've been memorialized, that there would be any reason someone would object to them. And so I think that if they were doing their job, we would know more about the people they were representing, right? And so the conversation is important, but I think the solution is often less appealing than what they were going for in that context. And I agree that, Native artists, but also, inviting the Native person to stand up and say, I think this monument's great, or I think, right, to actually to do the work and be the point person or the shield or whatever it is, right, actually avoids the necessity of everyone else to be having the conversation, and to not take obviously they should take our opinions seriously, and we've got plenty, but to not actually just hand off the responsibility of figuring out what the ethical thing to do and what the responsible thing to do is to one person or two people who say, oh, don't worry about it, it's fine. Or yes, right, like that this needs to be a thing that people come to their own positions on in ways that they're accountable to, because otherwise you create scapegoats and you actually create people who are being held up as the reason that something did or did not happen in ways that are really harmful to the community.
Wow. I can't believe we're at the end of our time, but that was just an amazing, amazing conversation, and so needed and important, and we need to continue these conversations. I just want to thank you, Jenny and Andrea, for joining us this evening, and as Chris said, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your thoughts on all of this. So thank you so much. I also, if everyone on our team here, Center for Native Futures, if everyone is comfortable to turn your cameras on so everyone could see who we are as a whole. There's Monica and River and Patrick, yay. So we are Center for Native Futures. We are all the co-founders here, and we just want to thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening and spending this time with us. We're still kind of figuring things out. This is all very new and fresh for us. So I believe you have my email address. So if there's any feedback or anything you want to share after this program, please feel free to send me an email, and just let us know what we did, let us know what we can do, to make these programs better as we move forward. But I just want to, Jenny and Andrea, do you have any final thoughts, any last words you want to part with?
Support Indigenous Peoples Day. Please write your alderman if you live in Chicago, and they're now collecting commentary for the removal of Columbus Day and for the support of Indigenous Peoples Day. So I would say get behind that, and thank you for showing up.
Yeah, I echo all of that. I also want to say, I have a plug, I think, for the conversations around land acknowledgements and what they do and don't do. And today's conversation, I think, is what land acknowledgements do. Like, that is the work of them, of thinking about place and land, and really digging in and taking the next step. And so, yeah, it's been fun to be a part of. And so I hope people are thinking about this kind of work as they go about their other types of things that they might be adopting in their lives and in their professional practices.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So thank you again, everyone. This is we have been recording. So as I said, we're so fresh and we're so new, we'll figure out how to get this to you. So thank you again, and have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Miigwech. Wado.